Charles. Charles, good morning. It's been, I think it was it Cairo I last saw you? I think
yes, it was Cairo. Yes, we last met before the pandemic hit us.
It was. The world has changed since then. It's good to see you. It's good to see all of you. And first of all, can I just thank you for the opportunity to be on this call and to share some of my thoughts over, as Charles says, it makes me feel very old actually, 40 years working in communications. I'm retired now, thankfully, but I'm helping out various people along the way. So yeah, 40 years in communications. And so today what I want to do is, rather than try and teach you, what I want to do is I just want to share some thoughts of what I've done over a number of years. So perhaps we did this a little earlier. I'm going to try and share a screen with you now, and hopefully this will work. Hopefully you can all see the screen.
Perfect, looks good.
Good. Well, let's go to the start then. So as I say, over many, many years, I was part of lots of different communications programs. As Charles said, I was there at the very beginning of Special Olympics Ireland. It was just a voluntary organization at the time. There was no people paid. I was the guy that was working in communications, so I was given the job to manage the communications. And to be honest with you, I didn't have a clue. We just made it up as we went along, and it turned out reasonably successful. So I suppose the point is that over the years I've learned, I've done some really good work in communications, but I've also done some really bad work in communications and made a mess of things. And I want to share with you some of the thoughts why I think things didn't work as well as they could, and why some of the things worked really well. So one of the things that I discovered over in those 40 years, and George Bernard Shaw, who is a famous Irish playwright, said it better than I could ever say it, said the single biggest problem about communication is the illusion that it's taken place. And that's a mistake that we make all the time. Just because I say something doesn't mean that somebody else understands it. So today I want to really focus around that thought. Because I say something doesn't mean that somebody else understands it. Over the years, as I say, I did a lot of campaigns, did an awful lot of work, wrote a lot of press releases, did a lot of talking with journalists, and a lot of the time we never hit our target. We just failed. We just didn't do it. So what we want to try and do is come to a situation where the communications campaigns that we do hit the target every time. And that's what we're always trying to do. Most of the time we don't do that, but what we want to try and do is get to that situation where we hit our target every time. So what we want to do today is talk about what makes for effective communications. What is a good communicator? I want to talk about that first. I'd like to hear some thoughts from you, and we'll talk about what makes a great communicator. And then from that, I want to talk about storytelling, because that's actually what we do. Communications is all about storytelling and telling stories well. And if we tell our stories well, then we can achieve the things we want to do through communications. And then finally, at the very end, I want to talk briefly about delivering our message and how we do that. So I want to start off by asking the question, what makes a good communicator? And I want to ask you actually, what makes a good communicator? And I'm going to ask you to do a little exercise for me. It'll take about 2 minutes, 90 seconds to 2 minutes. So what I want you to do is, I want you to write down 2 people who you think are great communicators. They can be famous people, they can be politicians, they can be sports people, They can be pop stars. They can be people you know in your own community. They can be people you work with. Anyone at all that you think are great communicators. So write down those two names for me. And then while you're doing that, will you write down why you think they're great communicators? So I'm going to stop talking for about 90 seconds. And then at the end of 90 seconds, I'll come back and hopefully you can tell me some of the names that you mentioned and why you think they're great communicators. So a little bit of silence for 90 seconds. Okay, about another 30 seconds. And we will ask, hopefully you can tell me some of the people that you have, you've put down. Okay. Hopefully you're all done. You have some ideas. So why don't we start? Charles, can I ask you, who are the two people you wrote down?
I wrote down, one of the persons I wrote down is Nelson Mandela.
Okay.
And I think Nelson Mandela, the reason I say he's a good communicator, he made his point, and many times I watched him make his point. There were very, very few, questions that needed clarification after he spoke.
Yeah.
Meaning that his communication, I'm assuming that his communication had been received and understood.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the one person that at first I wrote down as a good communicator, and the second person I wrote as a good communicator is somebody I know who was my lecturer at college,
mm-hmm.
and he communicated through many ways. And I always tell this story. One of the way he communicated when he wanted us to understand, he was our vice principal. He came in front, took off his jacket, something that he never used to do. He took off his tie, and then at the end, he told us that, how many of you remember what I was telling you? All of us couldn't remember. And he said, because I distracted you, I was taking off clothes. So he was excellent at that kind of communication. Every time he wanted to teach something, he did something crazy like that. We got it. So those are the two people.
Okay, it's really interesting. Thank you. Okay, is there somebody else who'd like to jump in and tell us who they chose as the people they thought were great communicators?
Lillian, if you're comfortable, I thought your responses were really good in the chat box. You feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, unmute yourself and talk to us.
Hello, Romy. This is Ross.
Ross, you also had a great answer. Please go ahead.
Hello,
yes,
Ross.
I put Tim Schreiber. And the reason I put him down was that when he speaks, he is audible, he is fluent, confident, and illustrates.
Okay, good choice, Ross. Well done. Yeah, I'd agree with that. Anyone else?
We have an answer from Lillian that she thinks of Barack Obama and Robert Mugabe, the former president of Zimbabwe, for the reasons that they are eloquent, charismatic, and they appeal to all ages.
Okay. Very good. Anyone else?
Clement, would you like to give your answer yourself?
Thank you, Varumi. How is everyone? Yeah.
Good morning, Clement.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for taking this time to inspire us. Yeah, looking forward to more. I chose my son in this interesting question because he always takes time to know me and to know where the situation I'm in, which needs certain communication is. And he chooses words, is never consistent, is never predictable. So he's very adaptable to the situations, and I've failed to actually tell somebody that this is the way this person is. You always talk like this because he always changes, but based on the analysis and the times. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really good. Thank you. I'm going to come back to actually what you said there in a minute. That's really helpful. Thank you. Maybe we'll take one more from somebody.
Hi, this is the person that came to mind was the chef Jamie Oliver. I'm not really into cooking and recipes, but there's just something about him that fascinates me when he prepares a meal. The way he communicates, he always keeps my attention. And when I see the final product, it's like never lost, just by the way he presented everything. Thank you.
Brilliant. That's another great example. Well, listen, they're fantastic. Thank you. They're better than I normally get, I have to say. But anyway, let me just share with you just a couple of the people that whenever I do this exercise, there's two people pop up all the time. Funnily enough, Nelson Mandela and Barack Obama always appear. I've done this hundreds of times, and the two of those always turn up. And then recently, who's turned up more is Siya Kolisi, the South African rugby captain, who, for me, is inspirational in what he says. So those two, Barack Obama, Nelson Mandela, and I would put Siya Kolisi in there. But I also could have put in Adolf Hitler, and I also could have put in Donald Trump. Two of the most effective communicators the world has ever seen. And I think what you've all touched on and you all talked about is, and Clement, I think you got it absolutely spot on when you said, your son takes time to know me. And the one thing all of these people do incredibly well is they understand their audience. And they understand who it is they're talking to. So that whenever they stand up in front of an audience, they take time to find out, who am I talking to? What are their concerns? What are the things that they're interested in? And they put themselves in the mind and in the place of the people where they're talking to. And that's called good listening, listening for the people that you're actually talking to. So what makes a good communicator at the very beginning is being a good listener. So every conversation, every good conversation starts with good listening. And I bet you've all have been in a hall or a room where somebody has been given a talk and you've sat there and you've wondered, what the hell is that person talking about? I've no idea what he's talking about or she is talking about. And that's because they haven't taken the time to listen to the people they're actually talking to. And Barack Obama does it splendidly well. Nelson Mandela was a master at understanding his audience. And so too was Donald Trump. You know, he understood exactly who his audience were, and he shaped his conversation around that. And he was extremely successful. And of course, we have Adolf Hitler, unfortunately, who was also extremely good at understanding his audience and talking to it. But the point I'm making is that for us to be successful communicators, we must understand who it is we're talking to. And one of the things that I have seen and I have done myself is I have not understood the audience I'm talking to. And then I would go about doing a lot of communication stuff, all the things that we do. And then when I didn't get the expected response, I would say, oh, they didn't get it. It was their fault. I did all the work. I had a lot of good things to say, but they didn't get it. But actually, the truth was, I didn't get it. I didn't understand how to tell my story in the world of the people that I want to talk to. So one of the most important things I want you to take out of this short session is that in order for you to be successful communicators, you must understand the audience you're talking to. It might be the same story, but you need to tell it in different ways. So that's one of the most important things that I want you to pick up from today. And what makes a good communication is about the message received, not the message given. And that's really important that you understand that. It's not about you, it's about the people you're talking to. And it's really important that you keep coming back to that every time and be disciplined about that. So whether it is you're going to a meeting and standing up in front of a group of people and telling them about Special Olympics, which is communication, you do it there. When you're writing a press release, are you doing it there? Are you writing some content for Facebook or whatever social media you're using? Are you thinking about the audience? Remember, it's the message received, not the message sent. And it's the one mistake I think that we all make and continue to make. Probably the biggest mistake I kept making in my communications life was getting that bit wrong and not taking the time to research who it is I was talking to. And nowadays, we're much better off because we have all this information out there, so we can go out and find out who they are and what it is. So very important that we get that bit right. So remembering all that, I want then to talk about your story, what it is, your Special Olympics story that you want to tell. Because remember, we're storytellers, and stories inspire people to do the things that we want them to do, to become part of Special Olympics as an athlete, to become a volunteer, to become a sponsor, whatever. It's how we tell our story that will inspire people to do things that we want them to do. So it's very important that we tell our story as powerfully as we can, that resonates in the life of the people that we want to talk to. So there's a couple of things that I would ask you to think about when you're writing your story. First of all, the audience. Sorry, I'm going to do, fine. Who am I talking to? What do they know? What do they not know? Because sometimes we presume that people know all about Special Olympics. Well, actually, they mightn't know anything about Special Olympics, so we have to tell them in a very clear, easy way what it is. You know, if you're talking to parents and you're trying to encourage them to send their children to a Special Olympics program, what are the issues in their lives that are preventing them from doing that? You need to know that. And then you can start to craft your story around them. You know, you talked about, Desmond talked about Jamie Oliver. Jamie Oliver was brilliant. He cooks and he stands up in front of people, but he makes it as if he's actually cooking the recipe for you. You're sitting there saying, wow, I could do that recipe. I'd love to be able to do that. He actually makes you feel you're the only person watching. And that's what you need to do. What are the issues? What are the things that resonate for these people? and you're going to craft your story. If you're going in to talk to somebody, a business person, a company, and you want their money, you know, what are their issues? The other thing too is you've got to think about, and this happens for all of us, what's in it for them? Why should I get involved? Why should I be interested? There's lots of other things I could do, but what's in it for them? So for parents, what's in it for sending their athletes to the program? There are lots of benefits, and you need to explain that to them. How can I make life better for them? How can I solve their business issues? If you become a partner of Special Olympics, you can become a greater part of the community. You can do more business. The business person wants to do more business. How can I help them do more business? So I need to craft my story in their world. So it's important that you do that. And then what you want to do in your story is, which is also really important and something that we don't do very well, is there's kind of three things I think you need to ask yourself. What do I want my audience to know? So at the end of reading my story or hearing my story, what do I want them to know? And it's very important that you actually write that down before you start. I want them to know 1, 2, or 3 things. So I'm going to shape my story around those 1, 2, or 3 things. If you don't know what you want them to know at the outset, you know, you're just going nowhere. It's a bit like going on a journey and you don't know where you're actually going. When you start out on a journey, you need to know where you're going. It's exactly the same way with storytelling and communications. You need to know what you want them to know, and that becomes the basis. We often start off and I ask people, what did you want them to know? And they would say to me, it could be 5 or 6 things, you know, and it doesn't really mean anything. So you need to be very focused on what it is you want them to know. The other thing that you want to do is, what do you want them to do? Become a member of Special Olympics, become a sponsor, become a volunteer. You need to let them know what it is what's the purpose of this communication. Because sometimes what we do is, and I've seen this all the time, and I've done it, is I never asked people what I wanted in my communication. So please become a volunteer. And here I'll tell you why you will feel better and why you'll be doing great work. But you need to ask people. So you need to put into it what it is you want them to do. Don't presume that they will guess. They won't. And the final thing is, and this is the really hardest part, but it's also the most powerful part, is what do you want them to feel? How do you want them to feel? So at the end of your communication, either they've read it or they've listened to it or they've seen it, what is it you want them to feel? And you mentioned the people that we talked about, you know, Nelson Mandela, Tim Shriver, for example. When you listen to Tim Shriver speak, you know, you get a sense of pride. You get a sense of, I want to do something. You feel motivated to go and do something. He leaves you with a strong feeling. And in the stories we tell, we need to think, how do we want people to feel? And that is actually probably the hardest thing in terms of telling our story, but it's actually the most powerful thing. So before you start out with your story, with your communication, you need to ask yourself, who are my audience? What's in it for them? And what message do I want to accomplish? What do I want my audience to know, to do, and to feel? Really important that we get that bit absolutely right. I mentioned that the 1, 2, or 3 things. The human brain can't cope with more than 3 things. It's the reason why we have a trinity. So in telling your story, I want you always to think about 1, 2, or 3 things that you want your audiences to know and remember. Not 4 or 5 things, not more than 3. So you start out with saying, that's what I want them to know, 1, 2, or 3 things, and that's it. And I'm going to focus around that. It might be just 1 thing, or it might be just 2 things, but never more than 3. And build your story around that, nothing else. So, in terms of telling the story, there's lots of different ways you can tell a story. But we often end up writing stuff and it's quite rambling. It's all over the place. I did it many times. But I think a good way, a kind of a discipline in what you're doing is to think about writing a story like I've shown you here. Start off with your headline. Special Olympics is a powerful force in the integration of people with intellectual disability into our communities. Bit of a long headline, but anyway, it's a headline. And the next behind that then, what are the facts that actually prove that statement? And there are lots of them. So what are the facts? And then bring it to life. Bring those facts to life with stories from your community, from your country, from your program that actually make those facts and the headlines stand out. That's the feel that we were talking about in our know, do, and feel. Bring it to life in terms of what we're talking about. The stories, and Special Olympics is full of great stories. So we need to do that. And then finally, I would suggest that you finish off by kind of going back to your headline and summarizing what it is you want to say. So think about when you're telling a story, you're telling it like that. So there is a discipline to the way you're telling it, rather than just rambling on and on, mentioning lots of different things. So within that headline, the facts that support it, the examples and the story that bring it to life. And there's nothing better than Special Olympics, to have stories and that bring facts to life to prove what we're actually saying. So then in telling the story, we go back to my 3 buckets. So you're telling your story. So around each one of the buckets of our story, we have our headlines, our facts, our stories, our pictures, and our bottom line. So we tell our story in a very disciplined way, rather than just writing it all down. And it's very important, I believe, that we do it like that. All the time remembering, what do I want my audience to know? And do I know my audience? So I'm telling my story in their lives. All the time having this discipline. So next steps. And this is something that I'm actually going to talk about next week a little bit more, but I just want to touch on it briefly now. So how can communication support my Special Olympics athletes? So recruiting more athletes. In terms of understanding your audience, where are they? Because this goes to the point of how you write your stories. Where are they? Do they know anything about Special Olympics? They might. They might not. They might actually have incorrect information about Special Olympics. So it's important that we understand that. And also, what is stopping them from joining? What are the things that are in their way? Is it parental issues? Is it cultural issues? Is it transport issues? What are the things that are stopping them from joining? And how can I build into my communications to address those issues that are stopping them from joining? There's some things that you may not be able to do. But there are, if you can, in your storytelling and in your communications, do I understand why they're not joining? So I need to include that into my story. Raising money. I'm sure all of you, I know we did in Special Olympics, we spent a huge amount of time trying to raise a little bit of money in a situation where people didn't really know anything about Special Olympics. And the other thing too is there were lots of other great charities also out looking for money. So it's a competition. So raising money from whom? Who are the people that are most likely to be able to support us? Who has the money? Some companies are very, have very big communications programs, and you hear a lot about them, but they don't necessarily have an awful lot of money to give away. And the other thing too is, why would they give to Special Olympics? What is it that they would like in Special Olympics that would give them, give money to you? And you need to think about that very carefully, what it is. And then the other thing could be recruiting volunteers. Where are you going to recruit them from? Where? What type of person are we looking for? And what are we going to offer them when they become a Special Olympics volunteer? And the point I'm making here is that you have a story of Special Olympics, one story, but you need to tell it in lots of different ways. So when you're telling the story about recruiting athletes or raising money or recruiting volunteers, we need to tell our story in a different way. And we need to mold and shape it in a different way. Because what I saw when I was starting out in Special Olympics, and I still see it in some of the programs, are they're just going out with the same story, hoping that people will respond. Same story, they're talking about recruiting athletes with the same story, they're talking about going to companies with the same story, they're talking about volunteers with the same story. And then when they're not effective, when they don't land, they wonder what the problem is. Or the company, they didn't really get Special Olympics. That's not true. You didn't explain it well enough to them, or you were in front of the wrong company in the first place. So it's all about understanding who it is we're talking to and shaping our Special Olympics story in many different ways to deliver the things that we actually want to achieve. The other thing what we need to do is, who and where are the people I want to talk to? Where do they get their information from? Really important that we can understand this, because if we don't, we could actually hit the mark here. We could miss our target. And in the earlier slide, you saw a visual of a target with lots of arrows missing the target. That comes down when you don't know where they get their information from. You're missing it. So do they get it from newspapers? Do they get it from social media? Television, radio, direct mail, one-to-one. Sometimes we waste an awful lot of time on communications when we could have gone and done 5 one-to-one meetings and we would have got the same amount of thing. Or what are the other ways that they get their information? So once we know that where they get their information from, then we can go and actually talk to them, communicate, and tell our story. But too often I've seen what we do is we get very busy doing lots of stuff in communication. You know, we do stuff in the newspapers and we do a bit of Facebook and we organize some radio interviews or whatever it is, but we've never actually thought about the people we're talking to, where they actually are, before we set out and do it, and we're just wasting our time. So it's very important that we do that. And next week I'll talk a little bit further about this. So it's very important then that we create our story, we understand our audience, and then we can start our campaign. But my point is that we need to be very focused. Too often we just go and do things and we're very busy doing not very much, or not being very effective. And I think that's what we need to do. So next time we'll talk about the communications plan and how I think, you might think about building up a communications plan and what you need to do and what you don't need to do. So that's for next week. So I'm coming to the end of my talking. I'm sure you'll be glad to hear. So what I want to do is kind of summarize what we've talked about today. We've talked about what makes a good communicator, understanding your audience, Nelson Mandela, Barack Obama, Tim Shriver, Jamie Oliver, Clement's son. They all understood their audiences. That's what makes a good communicator. And for you to be effective, you need to do the same. And this takes a bit of work, but you need to do it. Every time you go out and do a piece of communications, you need to do it. You need to then decide, what is your story? What is the story I want to tell? And then build your story around, what do I want them to know? What do I want them to do? What do I want them to feel at the end of that? And then you go about telling your story. So that kind of wraps up everything I want to say. I hope, as I say, you picked up some little thing out of that that will be helpful to you. And if you have questions, I would be delighted to try and answer them if I can. So, Romy, back to you.
Romy, before you come on, Romy. First, let me first and foremost, just share a little bit. I just want to say a few things, Julian, if you may allow me to add to what has just transpired today. In fact, as I saw this, how you were going through this presentation, Julian, I started thinking that I should be considering adding you to my list of good communicators, because of the way you just presented this, and you mentioned it in your delivery today, that how many times have we sat in sessions, presentations, and you've wondered, what the hell is this person talking about? When I looked at just the way you've done this today, Julian, is first and foremost, just your slide is inviting, because the slides that you use those examples, and you use examples and explained very well. You were slow, and because there's also translation going on, a lot of people just ramble through it really quickly. You were very clear. You paused in certain places and you gave examples. And today, not just teaching us communication, I think you demonstrated communication, and that's what I just wanted to thank you for, to say it. That's why I'm saying I want to add you to that list, because I think you've just demonstrated that. And if you heard me to the delegates, if you heard me from the beginning when I was introducing Julian, I mentioned the word wisdom. He mentioned how he started from a blank page, went through a maze, made mistakes, and so on and so forth. So he has gathered with the wisdom. It's not something that you go to a classroom and got, from being, a theory that you learned, and then you want to transfer that theory to other people. This is something that he's experienced and is put to practice, and it has worked. And I'm not surprised that you were the head of communication, you're the lead of communication in the 2003 games in Ireland. I attended those games, and I remember there was a video made, Irish Effect. It was the best games that were ever, put up in terms of things that happened at that, and the legacy, and so on and so forth, and how the community was transformed. It is because there was good communication at those games. Now I'm putting the pieces together, and I'm beginning to understand much more. So thank you so much, Julian. And for those that also don't know, maybe let me also just mention this, that Julian is also the husband of our CEO, Mary Davis, for those that didn't know. So Julian, again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for sharing wisdom and your experience. I have learned a lot, believe me, and I've already seen a lot of mistakes that I've been making. And today I will focus on the right things, understanding my audience first. So thank you, Julian. I really appreciate it. And I'll hand over to Romy to facilitate for questions and so on. But one more little thing before I do that, I also want to recognize the presence of our board member, Clement Chileshe, who's a board member from representing our region on the Special Olympics International Board. Thank you, Clement, for joining this meeting. It just shows the seriousness of how you take things, and an example that you are in the region to, we take things like this very, very seriously. You are such a great example. Thank you, Romy.
Thank you, Charles and Julian, for the wonderful presentation. I think the feedback that we've been getting in chat is that it was, we can assume that communication happened today because everyone is saying it was very clear, it was very informative. And another thing to learn from Julian is that he intentionally kept things very short and concise in each session, so that we can not only receive a clear message from him, but also have time to ask him questions. There's the two weightings of why Julian has such a great choice for our region and speaking today is not just the wealth and decades of professional and technical experience, but really because he's been where we've been when many of us have tried to look at communication starting from scratch for a program. Some of our programs are really successful and doing amazing things, but some of our programs are brand new. And it's just really wonderful to know someone that's walked the road of the Special Olympics program getting started in the communications field. So I'd really love to encourage you to ask those questions, those difficult questions that he also faced right in the beginning. Don't think your question is too small or too big. And we'd really like if you could ask it verbally, because we'd love to hear you and see you, but written questions are also welcome. And a reminder to all of our French-speaking participants, please feel free to ask questions in French, and please feel free to write your questions in French. Translation is available for you. So with that being said, I'm hoping that we have one or two questions for Julian, not just on his presentation, but we will also be getting next week as well a little bit more advanced into looking at the Special Olympics case. So please feel free and feel welcome. We still have quite a bit of time. So I'll be looking out in the chat. Otherwise, I'll just be giving us some silence so that people have space to reflect and ask questions if they'd like to.
Thanks, Romy. This is not a question, but just what I observe, a comment. Thank you so much, Julian, towards the end, for summarizing this presentation today in less than a minute. And that's one takeaway that I will take and use, because so many times we present something, but then we think we're done. You came back and in less than a minute, you took us through your whole presentation, and I thought that was brilliant.
Thank you. Desmond, I have an expression that I use, particularly for presentation training, is tell them, and then tell them again. So you tell them at the beginning of the presentation what you're going to tell them, then you tell them, and then when you get to the end of the presentation, you just tell them what you've just told them. And generally that they get the message. So thank you for that. I don't always do it, but I appreciate your comments.
Yes, wonderful. I think we're also getting presentation tips as well as just effective communications for PR, for public relations. So thanks, Julian.
Well, you know, Romy, I think actually, you know, when I talk about communication skills, we always tend to think of communication skills as being kind of formal communications, you know, newspapers and TV. But actually, when you go to a meeting and you're sitting in front of somebody, I think communication skills, this applies to, you know, when you go and meet somebody, you know, you meet somebody from your government, or, you know, you go into a meeting. I think everything we talk about is communication skills. And when we go to a meeting, we need to know what I want the person at the other side of the table to know. Who are they? You know, so when I say communication skills, I use it in the absolute broadest sense of not just, you know, public relations or whatever we think about. Communication skills are about us all in terms of understanding it. So I would encourage people not just to think of this as social media or whatever. Think about this in terms of the meetings they go to, you know, be it with government or other important stakeholders, I would bring the same discipline to those as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's so great to think of it as a discipline. I think that's something that I'm taking away is that practice that makes perfect, and the honing of our muscles, so that we're always ready to be the ambassadors or the spokespeople for the movement at a moment's notice.
Yeah.
I'd just like to read some of the feedback. Oh, sorry, did someone try to say something? Sorry about that. I'd just like to read some of the feedback just to say that the presentation was very powerful and relevant. Thank you to our teacher today, that it's a very useful session, a very clear and informative presentation, that is an excellent job, has been presented in such a clear way, and just in agreement with Desmond's comment to also what he's learned about telling them.
Mm-hmm.
And a thanks from Lillian from Zimbabwe, who's learned to be focused on knowing her audience. While we're looking at waiting for the next question to see if it comes, I had a more controversial question for you.
Okay.
Just to kind of ask, to be controversial, what are some of the mistakes that you've seen specifically a Special Olympics program make? And I know you work closely in a local program, but it doesn't have to be that program, it could be any program that has been kind of stumbling at that first hurdle that you've mentioned, that really didn't work in getting a good message for Special Olympics across.
No, I'll use Special Olympics Ireland because you know, it's now a very successful program, but it wasn't always a very successful program. You know, we started off with nothing, just a group of people, Mary Davis and myself and a few others. So I think there's a couple of things. I think what we tried to do, one of the biggest mistakes we made, and I don't know whether you're familiar with the expression of boiling the ocean. And what boiling the ocean means, trying to do too much. You know, setting out to try and do everything. That was one of the big mistakes we made. We just should have stopped and said, let's try and just do one thing at a time. And let's understand that we don't have a lot of resources. You know, it was a one-man band really, just me and whatever. So trying to do too much, I think, is just being practical in your ambition and saying, this is what we're going to do. And I think the other thing that I would say is actually presuming that everybody thinks Special Olympics is great. You know, we think Special Olympics is great, and it is great. It's one of the most powerful movements on earth. But there's a lot of other great, powerful movements on earth as well. And they're all doing their stuff and they're doing their thing. And actually, one of the things we learned was they were doing it much better than we were. And then we wondered why nobody was interested in us. Well, because we weren't as good as the others. So one of the things we learned very quickly was we needed to get up to speed. And even as I say, we only did one thing well, just do it well, rather than trying to do 5 things badly. You know, instead of trying to have, you know, have a recruitment program, a sponsorship program, this program, an athletes program, you know, an Alps program, everything going, you know, compromise and say, let's just put that aside and let's just focus on one thing and let's just get a win in this one area. And I think that's the one thing that I learned. I suppose I also would say is we didn't know how to tell our story. You know, we kind of just presumed because we knew all about it, you should know all about it. And it was really beginning to understand and craft that. The other thing too was we didn't, because we were so bought into the idea of inclusion and intellectual disability, we presumed everybody was. You know, I remember back for the 2003 World Games, it's 20 years ago, but it's not that long ago. We went in and we met all the newspaper editors, the main newspaper editors. And we like to even get into the meeting was a major achievement. And we sat there and we were asking them to give us coverage for this games that was coming up. They had no idea what was going to happen. And they told us that they didn't feel comfortable putting a picture of an intellectually disabled person in their newspaper. And we said, why? And they said, well, you know, it wouldn't be right for them, and it might upset their audiences. And we had never thought of that. For us, it was an absolutely, you know, normal thing to do, that you take a picture of an athlete and they would appear on a newspaper. But the newspaper editors were saying, well, we're not sure about that. Would that be taking advantage of them? Or we're wondering about, and we'd never thought about that. So we needed to tell our story in a different way in order to get over that barrier. We didn't understand that. So there's lots of things that we didn't understand that were hampering the way we were telling our story. And once we did that, once we said to them, the athletes won't mind, they love it. Imagine how their parents will feel, you know, as a vindication, as a validation of their son or daughter, if they're appearing in national media. And the people and the editors said, well, actually, we'd never thought of that. We'll do it. And then we reached another plateau and we moved on. So that's the kind of things that we learned.
Wow, that's a very powerful example. Thank you. That really helps. Definitely taking that away of doing one thing really well instead of trying to spread ourselves too thin right in the beginning before we've seen that success or seen that win. And that wonderful aha moment of finding out what the actual barriers in your audience are, of why you're not getting coverage, is you know, the myths and the stigma that we sometimes forget about because we are so involved in the space. But I was pleased to see a question from Zimbabwe, from Marianne, asking how long should a story be?
Okay, great question, Marianne. I'm going to answer this in a kind of a strange way. It should be as short as you can possibly make it. So if you can tell your story, I don't mean, you know, in a paragraph, but what you don't want to do is you don't want to have a long, I'm using Irish terms here, waffly. I don't know whether you have the term waffle, which is just going on and on and on. You should try and make it as concise and interesting as you possibly can. So, you know, the way they say, you write the story, just write the story first, and then go back and edit it, you know, as short as you possibly can. Make it as concise. Remember, think about the person who's reading it or watching it or whatever. Think, what would they want? You know, how many times, you know, have you started an article about something and then 4 or 5 paragraphs in you go, oh, here, and you know, and you move on. I do it all the time. You know, I read my newspapers and I read, you know, on Twitter and various things and articles. I see three paragraphs in and I'm going, oh, I'll go and make a cup of tea. You know, you need to think about what, you know, so at the very beginning, it needs to be very powerful. What's going to bring them in, bring them along the story? What's your big headline? What are the facts that support that? And then what will keep them in, Marion, will be your stories, the powerful, real stories around Special Olympics. That's what will keep them in. And then you need to ask them, what do you want them to do? I want you to support Special Olympics in lots of different ways. So it's a hard question to answer, but it shouldn't be too long. It should be as short as you can possibly make it, but make it interesting, if that's an answer.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And I think we'll be going a little bit further into that as well next week. I'm very excited to continue the discussion with Julian, and thanks for the great participation today. We look forward to seeing you next week and getting the chance to ask Julian even more questions. But I'm wanting to be very respectful of Julian and everyone's time, and I'll be closing it here. We will share the recording, and again, we'll be sending reminders on the WhatsApp group for next week's link. Please encourage anyone in your program that you think should hear this message to join us. And once more, a big thank you to Julian. Thanks, Julian.
It's a great pleasure, and thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Charles.
Bye.